Welcome everybody to today's IITE seminar, and it is my great pleasure to welcome Theresa Ong today, who is going to be talking to us about complex hysteretic patterns, hidden loops, and ecological traps. And without further ado, Theresa, the floor is yours. Please mute yourselves for the duration of the talk. Thank you. Not Theresa.
Thank you, Yuri. Thank you for the introduction and the opportunity to speak here with all of you today. So I thought I'd take the opportunity to present one of my favorite theoretical projects and one that I'm hoping to continue to develop experimentally once it becomes much easier for us all to move about and work in the lab. So I'll start us out with a question, and that's, what do all of these systems have in common? And feel free to jump in if you want. Anyone? Okay, so I'm sure we have a lot of creative answers. It's kind of difficult with the Zoom environment. So one that I expected from all of you here is that these are all systems that are thought to have alternative stable states. So cod fisheries can be plentiful, coral reefs can be healthy and full of live corals and fish, lakes can be in oxygen-rich oligotrophic states, precipitation and fire regimes can dictate grass-dominated savannas. But under the same conditions that determine these ecosystem states, we find that in some locations, cod can crash, corals can become bleached deserts, lakes can be in oxygen-deprived eutrophic states, and we can just as easily support lush forest systems with those same fire and precipitation regimes as savannas. So the theoretical basis for alternative stable states is relatively simple. Many of you here may be familiar with these systems, but I'll just review them briefly for clarity. So consider some driver variable for the system of your choice. So that could be fishing pressure, pollution, precipitation, for example. We'll put that on the x-axis here and examine how it influences the state of a system of interest. So that could be the number of fish, health of coral, etc. So in some systems, there are a range of values in which a system is either in a high state or other values where we find the state of the system in a relatively lower state. So these are called alternative stable states when there is a region of parameter space here along our x-axis where the same value of the driver variable can put us in either the high or the low state. But for the alternative states to be stable, the dynamics of the system should be pushing towards some equilibrium or set of equilibria that constitute that high or low value for the state of the system. So it implies that there is an unstable equilibrium from which the system moves away from and towards the two alternative stable states. So in such a system, if we were to start out at the low end of the x-axis, we find ourselves here in position 1 of the graph, meaning we are in the high stable state. And as we slowly increase the value of the driver variable along this x-axis, we wouldn't see much change in the y-axis or the state of the system at first past 0.2, 3 here, till we reach a 0.4 where we are suddenly tipped into the lower state at 0.5. However, if we were to start here at the high end of the driver variable on the x-axis and reverse directions, we begin in this low blue state and we would stay there in 0.789 until we find the other tipping point that pushes us back up to this high state. So these systems are thought of as irreversible because the path forwards is distinct from the path back. And whether you are in a high or low state can depend on your initial conditions. And this phenomenon is known formally as hysteresis. So the zone of hysteresis is where the system could be in either of those alternative states. So this pink zone here. So in this project, I'm using simple predator-prey models to demonstrate hysteresis, which I'll walk you through here. The Locke-Volterra model are classic equations that describe the population change of victim or prey and predator populations over time. And this version has predator satiation and logistic growth for prey. And then we've altered the equation slightly here to include an additional carrying capacity of the predator, which assumes that there is some limitation apart from food, which can be, for example, limited nesting resources that constrain the population. And this is an iteration of the model that has been done since the 70s by Neumeyer and others. So the next step would be, of course, to determine equilibria. So if we set these equations to 0, we can draw in the rough shape of the prey or victim isocline here in this phase diagram. And you might all remember this from classic population ecology. You have this hump-shaped form to the prey isocline. And now the predator isocline is drawn in, and typically that's just a line in the classic version of the model, but adding in this extra nonlinearity of the predator carrying capacity creates this curving effect to the predator isocline. And of course, where the predator and prey isocline is across is the equilibrium. So we'll just mark that here with this orange point, and then we can begin to track changes in the equilibrium. So we'll say here that we are specifically interested in the equilibrium value of the victim population. So over where that equilibrium crosses the x-axis. And so we'll plot that on the y-axis of the larger graph, which may be a species of conservation concern or an important fish stock, for example, or even a pest species. So now we can see how that victim population changes as we drive the system forward by, for example, changing the carrying capacity of the predator population. So that K determines where the predator isocline saturates in the phase diagram, which is indicated by that pink line in both of the graphs. So if we start at a low K, the victim population at equilibrium is relatively high. But as soon as we increase K, we're moving that predator isocline up. And suddenly, instead of just having one intersection with the prey isocline, we have 3. So 2 stable and 1 stable equilibrium, 2 of those appearing out from the blue sky, hence the name for that bifurcation. So you can see that green and blue equilibrium start to appear right here in the bifurcation plot. So as we increase K further, the equilibria start to separate apart in the phase diagrams, and you can see how that recreates the shape of our classic bifurcation form here. And then, as we increase K further, the green unstable equilibrium, it starts to edge closer and closer to the stable orange equilibrium. And when they collide, they annihilate each other, which leaves us with just the blue lower equilibrium, forcing us down into this alternative state. And so you can see that if we instead started here and started to reduce K, we began in this low blue state, and then we just move backwards through all of these previous diagrams. But we're still in that lower blue state, despite the existence of this alternative orange state, because we're stuck in the domain of attraction of the blue equilibrium until we're forced out of it as it collides with the green unstable equilibrium, bringing us back up to the only remaining equilibrium, the high orange stable state. So this is the theoretical basis of any system with alternative stable states and hysteresis. And though these dynamics are quite complex already, it is still a great simplification of real systems. In this example, we're only looking at one driver variable of hysteresis, but there are many potential drivers in a single system, and they're likely acting at the same time, particularly in this era of global change. So for example, assuming we are thinking about a marine system, there are increasing pressures like fishing, which can be reflected in the predator attack rate of our equations. But climate change is happening as well, and increasing temperatures might be influencing the carrying capacity of predators simultaneously. At the same time, we're living in an increasingly polluted world, and pollution can be affecting predator health and consequently satiation or conversion rates in our simple model. Pressures of introduced species can compete with prey and influence growth rates. And these drivers are likely correlated with one another in a diversity of manners. So, for example, rising temperatures have a positive correlation with invasive species in many places, especially if invasives actually benefit from warm temperatures, as they do in some cases. Negative correlations can also exist. For example, polluted waters may be less attractive fishing grounds for many people. And there are a host of potential hump-shaped or other nonlinear relationships with driver variables resulting from allele effects or trait-mediated indirect interactions. But these are just kind of broad brush strokes at trying to conceive of different correlations between parameters that are out there. So assuming
the
that
answers aren't the same.
So assuming that there are multiple potential drivers of a change in systems, and those drivers can be correlated in a variety of ways, I wanted to understand what the impact of these added nonlinearities would be for the dynamics of our simple predator-prey model. So we'll start by taking alpha, the predator attack rate, and imposing, so that's right here, and imposing a positive correlation with the predator carrying capacity K, like so. The model is quite simple, and the equilibria are equally solved. So we can just plot how exactly the equilibrium victim population or the prey population is affected by this increasing alpha that's correlated to the increasing K. So these are the results here, and it recreates the classic S curve of a typical critical transition where we have a sudden decline in the population. A negative correlation produces a similar S-shaped curve, but in the opposite direction. So instead of a sudden decline, we get a sudden gain. And in cases where we have a hump-shaped relationship owing to something like an allele effect, we observe a double hysteretic loop where the sudden decline is followed by a sudden increase. And we may be confused by that because we're just increasing alpha here if we were not aware that there is an associated correlation with a different driver variable in the system. So if the relationship were convex, the hysteretic patterns can become even more complex. This is what I call a hidden loop, which I'll detail in a bit. And for other nonlinear combinations, the patterns can be even more complex. So this is just an example of one relationship that could produce a double S curve with the hidden loop embedded in it. So this hidden loop structure has interesting management implications because if the state of the system was a population of conservation concern, and we started out here at a larger population and it started to drive the system forward, we'd eventually collapse the population. And then if some conservation practices were implemented in the goals of returning to the previous state, we could start reversing directions on the x-axis. But instead of, it wouldn't be just difficult to reverse directions and rescue the population. In some cases, it could be impossible just by changing the x-axis here, even though that could have been the reason for the decline in the beginning. So that's a distinct difference from the form of the classic bifurcation where hysteresis merely makes the system difficult to reverse, not impossible. So by now you might be wondering, how do these patterns emerge? Well, again, because we're dealing with a pretty simple model, we can plot the equilibria on a three-dimensional plot where we have the two driver variables here, attack rates and carrying capacity, plotted against the victim population at equilibrium. And so this 3D surface here, we have the colors corresponding to the orange, green, and blue equilibria of the previous plots. And And so we can see how geometrically cutting through this surface along one axis while keeping the second driver variable constant reveals that classic S shape of the bifurcation. And we can also move from monotonic to non-monotonic while keeping the alpha constant, but at an increasing level. So we can perform a similar analysis in the other direction, and you can place cross sections there, and we can see that the driver variables, that other driver variable produces a similar result. So you get this S-shaped bifurcation as well. And then you can see that if you start to correlate these two driver variables together, you can produce these more interesting shapes by essentially cutting cross sections through the surface in different ways, depending on the shape of those correlations. So here are the correlations from before plotted on that 3D surface. So you can see how you have a single S shape here, or double S shape here, or even these hidden loop structures that result from cutting through this 3D surface in different angles. So we actually tested this with all of the variables in the model and found that any of the combination of parameters could produce similar results. So here's the satiation rates and mortality rates for the predator, for example. And you can see how the different forms can appear from these cross sections. And the only requirement is that each of the parameters should separately result in hysteresis. So we should be able to produce a hysteretic relationship with the driver variable for each of the variables that you're correlating. And so here, this is growth rate and conversion rates. And in this example, you can see how the complex hysteretic patterns actually disappear as we move into this cusp bifurcation where the hysteresis is lost at the high values of predation and mortality rates of the predator. So I was interested to see whether we can detect these or other hysteretic patterns empirically. So I ran an experiment where I transitioned soil beds from completely organic inputs. In this case, I used earthworm casings, which are high in calcium and nitrogen, to completely synthetic inputs. So I used calcium nitrate as a fertilizer over time. And so every week, 40 new corn seeds were sown in the same soil beds. And each week I harvested the corn seeds and measured yield, nutrient leaching, and other state variables. So the goal was to see whether, as soil beds were transitioned forwards to a more conventional management, the effect of state variables like nitrate flux would be the same as when those same beds were transitioned back to their initial management conditions. So the null expectation is that these transitions would be the same back and forward, but if there are differences, then we could say that hysteresis is occurring. So these are the empirical results for the transition forwards from organic to synthetic fertilizer. The shaded area is the 95% confidence interval surrounding mean nitrate loss for each of 5 increasing values of synthetic to organic fertilizer use. And in blue here, we have the results when those trays were transitioned back to organic management. So at the two extremes, there's no significant difference. So the results are the same forwards or backwards. But here in the middle, we have hysteresis. So there's 2 alternative states existing at the same levels of management, depending on whether we start at the organic or synthetic end. And interestingly, this result implies that going back to organic management results in less nitrate loss than going forward. But perhaps, and initially I'd expected that soils that began synthetic to lose more nitrate, not less, but I think that perhaps the additional organic matter that is added with the earthworm casings is helping the soil to store more nutrients. And I'd love to discuss details of this if people have ideas later. But for now, I want to focus on the fact that we found hysteresis in this experiment. So we had 2 alternative states for nitrate loss to the system. And this is where most studies of hysteresis in soils stop. But if they are stable states, then the trajectory should be pushing towards each of the alternative states. So that implies there's an unstable center where the dynamics are being pushed out from. So I wanted to see if we could experimentally detect this unstable center. So I devised an experiment where our trays were transitioned forwards and backwards at the same time. And so when they reached these at this mid synthetic level, a synthetic fertilizer level, we mixed the forward and backward trays 50-50. And we did this so we could force an initial condition that would lie in between these two alternative states. And then we perturb the system to the left or right by adding a little organic or synthetic fertilizer to see whether the system would be pushed as expected for an unstable center to one or the other alternative stable states. But because we don't know a priori where this unstable state is, we actually mix the trays at 1/3 and 2/3 levels as well. So these are the results here. And the white dot is the initial condition, and you can see the dynamics were pushed down and up to the black points. And the right side perturbation makes perfect sense. We perturbed the system and jumped up to the top stable state. The left side perturbation implies there might be some stable point here in the middle that I've just drawn in where the dynamics ended up. And then when we mix the trays 50-50, these were the results here. So again, this one makes sense. And we can fill in another sort of stable line here that could catch where that point fell. The two-third mixture, they both jumped up here, so we don't need to add in anything. And if we draw in hypothetical dashed unstable curves to connect all of our known solid stable points, which sort of makes sense dynamically, we can get this summary chart of how the dynamics might function for our system. So we expected hysteresis, but in the literature, hysteresis is most often drawn like the simple S curve on the left. Here we show empirically, and also in our models, that there may be more complicated hysteretic patterns like this double S curve on the right, hysteresis within hysteresis. And on the outside, the dynamics are the same. So forwards transitions look like this, and backwards transitions would look like this. But our empirical results show that there may be this stable state hidden within the hysteretic curve. So if we began in the middle here, we could be in some ideal state for nitrate flux, depending on the ecosystem. But if we were to shift our management styles a little to the right or to the left, we could lose this middle ideal state forever. So what do these patterns mean for people trying to restore ecosystems? If hysteresis is as common as the literature and our little experiment and model show, then we should expect that the way back may not often be the same as the way forward. Reversing ecological degradation via abandonment or restoration efforts may not successfully return to previous, will not necessarily bring us back to previous conditions without extra efforts. And that's something I think that a lot of restoration ecologists understand. And in some cases, management alone may not be enough to regain those lost states. So failure to recover systems may be a sign that hidden states or ecological traps may exist. So similar to the idea of gilded or poverty traps in the social sciences, we may find ourselves stuck in these cycles of low productivity ecosystem states that may need additional management that recognizes exactly where the points of hysteretic transition are present in order to actually successfully move the system up to an alternative state and intervene in that sensitive zone. So if these hidden states are common, then understanding the underlying dynamics of human managed systems are necessary if we have particular management goals and expectations for specific ecosystems. So with that, I'll thank you all for your attention and take any questions.
Thank you so much, Theresa. So if anybody has questions, then on the participant list, please raise your hand, and then I will call on you, and then you can ask questions. So any questions? Yes, Amanda, please go ahead.
Hi, I was wondering, is it possible by mixing the two states that there could be a chemical reaction that could make the average maybe not as accurate as it could be? I'm just curious.
Yeah, that's a good question. I suppose that's always possible, but and there are definitely like synergistic effects from different microorganisms happening and so if they are in very distinct sort of ecosystem states, I think that would be possible. But given how homogeneous like the soils are, and because they're just in such a small scale, I would imagine that would be less likely in our experiment.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
Thank you. Atma, sorry if I'm butchering the name.
That's fine, really. So thanks for a great talk. So it's really interesting to see these hidden loops emerge. And I was wondering, have you considered, so I get that these impossible states are existing because of this hidden loop stuff, but have you, what kind of perturbations can we do to the underlying system to get away from the hidden loop and go back to a double S, for instance?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I think that if we had perfect understanding of the dynamic structure of a system, and it could be a simple system maybe, and we knew where the hysteretic zones were, and that's, I think, starting to develop because we have this idea of like critical transitions and predicting where those are. Then what we can do, instead of just manipulating the management that got us in trouble in the first place, like fishing effort, etc., we can instead manipulate the y-axis, which depends on the state of the system that you're interested in. So if it was like a fishing stock, maybe we would add additional fish to the system at that point in order to recoup that that alternative state.
Oh, yeah, thanks.
Thank you. Eva, please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. So in the predator-prey model you started with, I expected to see hoof bifurcations as well.
In this particular model, I mean, there is, I mean, the Hoff bifurcation would happen, I think, with a more complex model. This iteration just has that saddle node bifurcation with the parameters that we varied. But if we added additional complexity to the model, that's possible as well. It just depends on what we're varying, I think. But that's something we could explore. I mean, there's so many different types of dynamics in these simple models to explore.
Okay, maybe related to that, Henry is sending a question in the chat saying, can't use sound, but here's a possible question. What might the role of various forms of noise and or high dimensionality be?
Yeah, so I think that there are many layers to that. So noise can be pushing us between the alternative states. It can also be sort of an excuse to think that the system is more indeterminate than it is. So I mean, classic debates of whether ecological systems are deterministic or stochastic. I think there's something here with this, like if these like hidden loops are possible, then some of what we think of as stochasticity can be deterministic. But certainly once we start adding additional layers of complexity by adding additional dimensions, so other predators, other pests in the system, other prey, then we increase the complexity of the dynamics that are possible. And so I think it starts to become that question of like whether the observations that we observe are actually the result of stochasticity or deterministic factors in the model, and whether that actually matters. And it may or may not depending on how we are hoping to rescue these systems, right? So if the system is stochastic, then we may not need to think so much about the underlying dynamics of the system to rescue those states. But if it's not, if it is indeed like an important force that these hidden states exist, then maybe we need to reconsider that.
Thank you. The next question was from Giza, but before that, my apologies. I think I would like to flip the order because there's one simple question in the chat that you can probably answer very quickly. Liliana is asking, I didn't get exactly what with the fertilizer and also what kind of soil that was, from where, and was it somehow treated? Sorry if I just missed it.
Yeah, so the soil is just organic potting soil. So it's a mixture of just like peat moss and silt and sand and probably some vermiculite or the other sort of grains that add a little bit of extra structure to the soil so that you can have more water retention in it. And but the compost, so the addition of the earthworm casings, it comes as like a mixture of earthworm casings that are industrially produced, but organic as well, versus the calcium nitrate, which is just a blend of chemicals that gardeners use, and so do farmers use on their plots.
Thank you. Giza, please go ahead. Giza, are you there?
Unmute. So, Theresa, I would like to ask your general impression whether in a real conservation situation, do we have a chance to understand the system sufficiently to think about the hysteresis? It is easy in many cases, or it's very complicated. What is your feeling about this?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that certainly some ecosystems will be easier to understand than others. I think that soil systems are probably good systems to start because they have been recognized by soil scientists to exhibit these hysteretic behaviors quite often in experiments in the lab, but also I think in the field. And so I think soil systems might be a good place to start. Also, agriculture is a good place to start as well, because the systems tend to be a little less complex than some natural forest systems. But I think in general, systems that already kind of have signs of having alternative stable states might be easier to understand than others. And perhaps being able to pinpoint specific alternative stable states is already a sign of some limitation to the complexity of the system, even though that's often the opposite of what we go in thinking about it.
Great, thank you. Axel?
Hello, Theresa. I want to add maybe to what Geza was asking. So I'm not convinced that these multiple stable states are common in nature. And it troubled me because our funding agency gave lots of money for people who can figure out the multiple stable states, and I couldn't apply for this. Mm-hmm. And then I was very happy to see last year this paper from Helmut Hillebrand, who says, oh, we cannot see in data threshold behavior. He looked at 36 different meta-analyses and made the meta-analysis of these. We can't see much of it happening.
Mm-hmm.
So is there a way, how is this resolved, this kind of these different impressions between there is not much of it and it's a common phenomenon?
Yeah, so that might be the case, right? So if these alternative stable states are more indicative of like a more like simpler systems where we can actually observe the phenomenon, and maybe there are these hidden states in what we consider more stochastic systems, right? And they're just harder to detect because the complexity is amplified.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it's still a mixture of the two happening. But what it means practically for management, I don't know yet, but it would be interesting to continue to develop this to see if there are things we can do experimentally in like these more simple systems to actually move us out. So can we detect like these hidden states pretty regularly? And then if we do, can we then effectively move us into alternative states for those systems? I think that would be the first place to start before we try to apply it broadly and think about ecosystems broadly.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Mike, please go ahead.
Hi, Theresa. Thanks. That was a really clear presentation. I really enjoyed that. So I'm kind of maybe building on the last couple of questions. Do you have any results already or any insight or just a gut feeling about whether, well, when you add more drivers to the system, does that introduce kind of even cooler cycles or fractals or something into the phase space there? And I think you've kind of touched on it in your last answer. Is that potential for increasing complexity fooling us into thinking systems are simpler than they maybe are?
Yeah, I think so. I haven't started developing the experiments to know yet, but my gut reaction is definitely that as we add additional layers, we're just going to be cutting through these surfaces in more interesting ways, and that will produce sort of signatures that we already kind of recognize in ecology, like fractals and things that we find in natural systems that could be indicative of this type of relationship. And so, yeah, I do think that it's a combination of the two, that what we consider really complicated in ecology could be actually a sign that those systems are simpler in terms of the dynamics involved and the dimensions involved, which is kind of beautiful to me to think about. But yeah, I don't know. I'm just kind of riffing.
Thank you so much. Chris Kosmeyer has a comment, says, minor comment, these isolated equilibria are sometimes called isolas in bifurcation theory. Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. I did not know that. In any case, are there any other questions? While people are thinking whether they're having questions, Axel has a question. So Axel, please go ahead.
Sorry for invading again. I have a
Okay.
technical question about your experimental result with the internal kind of thing. If you could show this.
Oh, do you want me to show it?
Yeah. Oh, if it would be nice. Yeah.
Let me see if I can get back. This one?
It's not yet that. Yes. So of this S-shaped thing in the middle, if I follow your arrows, I think the upper edge of the S should also be dashed.
This one?
Of the red thing. This one should be dashed.
Well, so
the arrows are pointing away from it.
Oh, right here.
Yeah, and so similarly you have it on the bottom. So only the middle part of the S would be there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
And
yeah,
now,
that's tricky. You have to be very careful where you're drawing it.
and so I'm a bit concerned that actually what you see is that the state is just hanging around a very long time near this unstable equilibrium, but it's not stable. It's just because you're so close to it, you can't really move away for it during the experiment.
Yeah, I think that there is some truth to this, and that's something we're trying to suss out with this data, actually, because you know, each of the points is taken with several replicates, and so there's variance around it, and these alternative states are also the same way, right? There's a confidence interval around it. So working with that and trying to understand what is a significant difference and not becomes complicated. And I think it also is interesting because there's like this discussion of chaotic hysteresis where you're jumping between alternative states within that will be interesting to look at as well, because it could maybe be detected with an experiment like that where you're jumping between the states and you're specifically forcing change in that space. But you're right, we need to look more closely at this, and we're kind of at the first stages of that.
Okay, thank you. There's a question from Liliana again. It says, did you look at community composition or maybe some functional trait related to the nitrogen cycle?
So no, they were just done in like a greenhouse setting with potting media. So we didn't look at any of that, but that would be definitely something interesting to look at. I don't think there would be a huge community difference in terms of microbes in these very simple systems, but that's one hope that we're hoping to go direction we're thinking of going in by doing these experiments in the field and seeing if real systems have these behaviors when we manipulate them similarly. And then we can start looking at questions of community composition, whether that's like the weeds in the system or the microbes in the soil.
Thank you. Are there any other questions? Steve, yes, please go ahead.
Hi. So thanks for the talk. Very interesting. I have this sort of intuition that the way you get alternate stable states is sort of from double negative feedbacks, right? Between two species or two groups. Either one is up and two is down, or two is up and one is down. So maybe I'm wrong and you can set me straight. But is there some intuition like that for when you get these isolated stable states sitting in the middle? Sort of what kind of feedback structure in the network tends to give you hysteresis with these extra twists?
That's a good question, because I think that you could probably answer that question if you looked at the correlations to see whether the directions are moving have like a positive or negative relationship, and you can sort of ask that question. And I do think that we get these more complicated structures as we add non-linearities in the system, and so that would make sense that you could have positive correlations and
okay.
Feedback.
Okay, but what about that picture that you just showed, where you had sort of the the alternate stable states, but then there was a third one in the middle? Is there some sort of I don't know, some sort of idea about what kind of interactions would be likely to make that happen?
I think you're right that it should be systems that have, well, I think that they should be multi-dimensional systems where you have like this positive feedback loop, but an additional dimension that has a similar feedback, and then they're related to another. And that's how,
okay.
Yeah, you would produce that result.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you. Are there any other questions?
Just a quick comment on the follow-up on the last one. In spatial models, you can get really cool kind of snaking patterns of hysteresis where you get, 5 or 10 alternative stable states. So the transition is kind of like a staircase.
Like a ladder. Yeah, I've seen those as well. And yeah, I think if you're folding the manifold in certain directions, you can also produce those.
Yeah, and in some sense, you can think of like a species-rich system. In some sense, there's some analogs there to the spatial example where it's like a cascade of species changes. Yeah, so it's a little bit of a start.
Yeah, so we can, if we're manipulating like the landscape as well, that could be like one way to sort of move stepwise on that, assuming that there's sort of a feedback happening at the landscape level as well that's going along. So that would be cool to think about.
Thank you. Any more questions? While people are thinking, I actually wanted to ask/comment. One thing is, Steve already mentioned that, but what I was thinking is, can we actually create a minimal model that produces that particular hysteretic pattern? I don't know if you've been thinking about this, and how many variables would that need? Can you do it in a 2D system, or that's just not possible?
Yeah, so the system that I was showing you here, the predator-prey model, has like nonlinearity in both of the isoclines, but you can also produce these patterns if you have sort of, the classic Carpenter model with the sigmoid curve and a straight vertical isocline in it as well. And so that'll also produce these patterns. As long as your correlations are kind of moving through that, it doesn't necessarily matter. I think that the minimum is that you need this the bifurcation where you actually have the possibility of 3 equilibrium with 1 unstable one in the middle. I think that's the minimum, but I could be convinced otherwise.
Thanks. But I actually had another question, which I will turn to after looking at Axel's comment here. Could it be that in Theresa's experiment, part of the soil block went to the upper state and part to the lower state, and so the average is in the middle? Okay, so spatial structure again, I guess.
That is interesting. So if we had sampled more regularly, I don't think that's the case, because in this experiment, to get around that, we manipulated the soil and we mixed it at each stage. And so it kind of gets rid of that kind of spatial structure. But in real systems, I definitely think that's true.
Thanks. Other questions? And while people are thinking of questions, I'm going to ask my other question, if I may, is what's the resolution of the experiment? So how finely can you control where you are? And so in other words, how accurate of a picture of this bifurcation plot can you actually glean out? And how many times do you need to replicate? And how accurately does it go back to the same state? Yabba dabba, you know what I'm asking.
Yeah, so that's a good question. I definitely think that this experiment is too simple. I don't think it was fine enough. This is what I could do in one season at that time when we were doing it. But I think it's a great starting point, because now we have this idea of what could be there and to design a better experiment. The trick with this experiment is that you have no idea where you are during the whole process. So because you're starting at both ends, you're moving in the middle, and you have no idea where any potential unstable equilibrium is, the best experiment would be to very finely control all areas of the phase plot, right? And then manipulate every single little deviation. And so it depends on how much time and effort you have to be able to do that. But that's something that I'm hoping to sort of move towards, because the more fine you are in your manipulation, the more accurate I think your depiction of the system will be.
Yeah, thanks. And so what I'm trying to get at is not knowing this system well, and your talk being very convincing, are there sort of reasonable alternative explanations for why you see this getting stuck in the middle that is not an alternative?
Yeah, I think the most reasonable explanation is that that's just stochasticity. There's some error there, and we're just sort of trapping what's already the alternative stable states, like in that diagram. And so that is one possibility, and it would be resolved if we did a finer scale experiment and more replications of each little bit. But again, we would have no idea from the beginning where to start, so it would have to be a lot of effort.
Also, I don't know how much time these things take, so I'm very naive in these things, but can you be sure that you sort of waited enough to reach the stable state?
Yeah, that's another good question, and we're all sort of limited by time for doing experiments and the length of the growing season as well. And so these were done sort of transitions within a week, and I think for the fact that the experiments were at such a small scale, that's not an issue. But if you're thinking about real like farms, that's definitely not long enough. And you would probably need, years to understand that kind of dynamic.
I always wondered how long it takes for a farm to get into equilibrium. I mean, such a concept exists, I assume, right? You put manure down, you have the animal, right? So farm, but I have no idea what the time scale for that.
Yeah, that's the point, that we might just never be in equilibrium.
By the way, there is a question from Mara Bardena. Is this work published? Could you give us the reference, please?
Yeah, this work is, the model is published in Theoretical Ecology, and I can send it along.
Can you put it in the chat, maybe?
I can get the link up here.
Anyway, and we have a few. One more. A comment on my first question. At a stable state, alternative stable states come in a third order Taylor expansion. So a first guess might be fourth order ODE system. Yeah, no idea of ecology. Yes, okay, that's a very good point, actually. Thanks, buddy. Yes.
Yeah, I'd love to talk more if you want to reach out.
Oh, and thank you. There's the link. Perfect. All right, so I will ask my favorite question. That is, are there any other questions? DB theory has an answer to time to equilibrium for individuals and by implications for populations. Thank you. Yes.
Yeah, the data are not yet published. So that's why, so it's not like fine enough scale. And so that's one thing we're thinking about, that we might need to go back and do more experiments before we publish that set.
Yep. Okay, last time I will ask questions. Anything else? Please go ahead if you have any. Yes, there is one in the chat from Liliana. At which rate was the change occurring? And that is cool, by the way, and impressive to see the link between theories and practice. I agree.
Thanks. Yeah, we did the transitions, I said, on a weekly basis. So we changed it every week. We would force transition.
Yes, anything else? If there are no more questions, then thank you so much, Theresa, again, for this presentation. And thank you for coming, and thank you everyone for attending. Next time, same, it's going to happen in 2 weeks. Actually, I'm going to present, I believe, in 2 weeks, but Geza will correct me. Yes, I will. Really? Thank you. Good to know.
So you cannot have the moderator next time.
Yeah, thank you. Yes, the only thing is, by that time in Europe, we will have adjusted the clock. So those of you who are in Europe, it's going to be 5 in London, 6 Central Time, as opposed to what we had today, so one hour later. For those of you in the US, you don't have to care about this at all.
Well, thank you so much. It was really great to be here.
It was very, very good to have you. So thank you all and see you in 2 weeks.
Bye.
Bye. Bye.